Okay, welcome everyone to the workshop on Beyond the Binary. Um, uh, Good afternoon. I think it's afternoon everywhere now, except perhaps Jean from Hawaii and anyone else participating from Honolulu. I want to do a couple of housekeeping items first. Number one, this session is being recorded. So anyone who's on camera is on could show up in the meeting, in the recording. And if you do not want to be recorded, please turn your camera off during the entire workshop. Secondly, we have it's a limit on hopping. Only 20 people, maximum of 20 people can be viewed on the camera at a time. So, you may only be on part of the time. At this point, we're showing 12 people, so everyone should be visible if you desire to be on camera. Final thing is, if you want to ask a question, feel free to type it in the Q&A section using the tabs on the right side of your screen. And Maddie Marlett is our moderator. Maddie's going to be tracking the questions, and she will guide us in responding to those later. If you also, in terms of a question, if it's a question that you have a similar or you like that question, as we did earlier, you can give it a thumbs up. So the more thumbs up a question has, more likely that it's going to be answered. Okay, so what I'd like to do now is introduce the panelists and give you a little background on them, starting with Delphine. Delphine Bautista is a native of Miami, Florida, with both Cuban and Salvadoran roots. Delphine is a social worker, active theologian, writer, and diversity educator with a Master in Divinity from Yale University and a Master of Social Work from the University of Pennsylvania. As a Latinx, trans, and queer person of spirit, Delphine is passionate about intersectional justice and resilience, especially around the experiences of queer people of color. Delphine currently serves as coordinator and faculty for Campus Pride's Advisor Academy and serves on the Vision Council for Call to Action. As a writer, Delphine has contributed to CTA's blog, DignityUSA's Breath of the Spirit, and preaches on their own blog, La Lucha Mi Palpito. And Delphine uses the pronouns they, them, and els. The Reverend Jason Carson Wilson is a Black gay advocate who serves as the DC-based Bayard Rustin Liberation Initiative's founding executive director. That organization engages in angelic troublemaking to secure justice and liberation for Black and LGBTQIA+ people. Wilson also leads Chicago-based Community Renewal Society's LGBTQIA+ advocacy network. He, who describes himself as a Catholic adjacent Protestant, is a member of Dignity USA and is a Dignity Washington board member. Katie Hoyt grew up in a large Catholic family that valued Catholic education. Katie is a proud alum of Immaculate Heart of Mary Grade School and Bishop Shuttard High School. Katie currently resides in Indianapolis with her two daughters, one of whom is transgender, and devotes her time to advocating for LGBTQI rights in the church and beyond. And as for myself, Linda Roberts, I am a transgender woman who currently lives in Central Florida, originally from Washington, D.C. I consider myself a very visible activist and advocate for the LGBTQI community and the transgender and non-binary population in particular. I serve as treasurer of Dignity USA, and I'm also a member of Dignity Washington. I was honored in 2018 with the Engendered Spirit Award as a Capital Pride hero in Washington, D.C. on behalf of the Capital Trans Pride and Capital Pride Alliance. I've also, in my capacity with DignityUSA, authored the frequently asked questions content on our DignityUSA website, and also written on a number of other documents on the issue of gender identity and Catholicism. I volunteer with Global Volunteers, and I'm also an approved prison visitor. I have 2 sponsored young girls in India and the Philippines, and I spent a 40-year career in finance and accounting. So that is my background. What I'd like to do is briefly talk about the issues that we're going to cover today, and then each of the panelists will talk further about the issues. The areas of interest, and there's a lot happening with respect to transgender, non-binary persons, particularly as it relates to the Catholic Church, but in society in general. And I think it's important that all of these issues be at least covered to some extent. We're going to talk about Catholic education, talk about Catholic healthcare, the Equality Act, and participation in sports. But first I want to talk about just the church's teaching in general, because that sets the framework for this. Basically, the Catholic Church, the hierarchical church, has no official teaching that on transgender, non-binary gender identities, but it has been developing its doctrine over the last several decades, in particular the last decade. Official documents have outlined the church's position as follows. Number one, non-binary identity theories or ideologies, the term they use, are believed to be anathema to the complementary relationship between a man and a woman, and contrary to the innate biological differences between male and female. This is what the church believes. It believes that non-gender identities that do not conform to biological sex are a threat to the institution of marriage and family development, and that gender transitioning, which may include forms of sterilization, hormonal or surgical, which the church opposes as morally wrong. The statements made by the church officials have generally condemned gender identity as unethical, demonic, social construct, a permissive sexual moral problem, false reality, a state of confusion, or simply a matter of choice. All of these terms, now just bear in mind, all these terms being communicated to the Catholic population set the stage for the attitudes and the policies that have developed because of what the church is now developing as the doctrine around gender identity. Talking about Catholic education, in 2 years ago, June of 2019, the Congregation for Catholic Education released a document called Male and Female, He Created Them, Toward a Path of Dialogue on the Question of Gender Theory and Education. So this was to provide a framework for Catholic schools and institutions as to how they were to relate to transgender, non-binary persons. The document is a lengthy, rambling, stereotyping document which picked up on some of the same concepts I just mentioned, considered gender identity to be a choice, and that it had a destabilizing effect on society. The document had a very strong emphasis on traditional male model, man and a woman, and that was the best environment for children to be brought up and educated. So basically, it reaffirmed that although it indicated that it was going to be a path of dialogue, the document really doesn't promote a dialogue. It really basically asserts its own positions. And so what has happened now in at least 5 dioceses in the country, Minnesota, Springfield, Illinois, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Lansing, Michigan, those are 5 that I know of. They've all come out with policies and practices dealing with their Catholic educational schools. And essentially what they say is that there should be no recognition of gender identity in dress or in names or pronouns, in the facilities, in sports, or in curricula. And that applies both to students and to parents and volunteers and teachers. All of those have to comport themselves in accordance with their biological sex. So that's where we are with Catholic education. We're going to talk to Kate. Katie's going to talk about her daughter, Elizabeth, and the experience she's had with Catholic schools. Catholic healthcare. In 2018, the United States Conference on Catholic Bishops, USCCB, issued its 6th edition of a document called Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare Services. That document, in a sense, said that Catholic healthcare services will encounter requests for medical procedures contrary to the moral teachings of the Church, and that it would not offend the rights of individual conscience by refusing to provide or permit medical procedures that are judged morally wrong by the teaching authority of the Catholic Church, essentially saying that any Catholic healthcare institution should not administer any medical procedures, hormones, surgical, etc., that essentially the Church considers to be morally wrong. And Delphine is going to be talking further about the issue with the healthcare. The Equality Act was reintroduced in Congress earlier this year. It passed the House, and it's awaiting consideration and vote by the Senate. This act would essentially eliminate a lot of the current discriminatory practices that states have against the LGBTQI population and transgender and non-binary individuals in particular. And there are currently 27 states that lack anti-discrimination statutes. So we can't rely strictly on states passing non-discrimination laws for our community. So that's why this Equality Act is so important. And it would identify gender identity as the identity, appearance, mannerisms, or gender-related characteristics of an individual, regardless of the individual's designated sex at birth. And it would allow access to public accommodations, employment, public facilities, and public education within the gender identity that someone identifies as. And Jason is going to be talking further about that. The last thing is participation in sports, which I'm going to cover later. Basically, there are, I mentioned the Catholic schools. Basically, the policies and practices have come out are prohibiting transgender girls from participating in women's sports. And on the other hand, trans males, of course, would also be prohibited from participating in men's sports. But the emphasis is on the women, where they think biological males have a biological advantage. So I want to talk about that and some of the state legislative efforts that are currently passing through state legislatures to reaffirm this opposition to transgender females participating in women's sports. So it's a big agenda. I know there's a lot of things to cover because, again, there's a lot of issues out there today that affect our population. But I want to go back now to the Catholic education and Katie Hoyt. So Katie, I would like you to tell us what the school officials told you about the requirements for your daughter to attend the local Catholic school, and what the denial of admission or admission only on the conditions established by the school officials to your local Catholic high school and a Catholic education has meant to you and your daughter. Oh. Okay, if you can unmute yourself, Katie.
Sorry, my paper flew away.
Okay.
As you all know, this is a pretty sensitive topic for a lot of families right now. As Linda had said, I grew up, I'm number 7 of 9 kids in a very Catholic home. One of the greatest gifts my parents gave us was Catholic education. All 9 of us went to a Catholic grade school and high school. And we adopted our oldest daughter, Elizabeth, from Guatemala when she was 7 months old. We had her in St. Matthew's, the Catholic high school, because those are the values I wanted, until 2nd grade. And we moved because she's dyslexic. So we went to another school and hoped after getting her learning under control, we could go back to our Catholic high school. And that's a challenge that we feel rejected by the church, because it's been going on for a while, although we did a rally last summer just pleading the Archbishop, because yes, my daughter is allowed to go to a Catholic school, although she will only be, her name has been changed. She would only be able to go as Joshua, and she'd only be able to go to the boys' bathroom, and she's got long hair, the most beautiful girl you've ever seen, along with some other restrictions, pronouns and things. And so that's an option that I could not put her through. So they're saying, yeah, sure, but here's our restrictions.
Right.
And so it's been really difficult on Elizabeth knowing, okay, at public schools, I'm rejected by students and stuff. Although just being rejected by a community that is so important in our lives, just feeling that the Archbishop's words just really stung on that. And so my goal and mission is to see for the next, I know we're not going to be able to change it for this generation, although I think what the work Linda is doing and everyone at Dignity is doing, hopefully the next generation will get that opportunity. Because one thing that I wrote a letter to the Archbishop and said that, all of us feel the same way. The God that we believed in believes in equality. And that's what I want to see from our God. But the church is not making it easy.
Thank you, Katie. Yeah, that's a really tough situation. So her daughter, transgender daughter, would only be allowed to attend the Catholic school if she were to present as male and on her biological sex, and under those conditions, which were not acceptable. So essentially, with the Catholic Church,
she transitioned 8 years ago, and so she is extremely. I mean, that's her life. Honestly, she does sometimes identify as transgender until these topics reject her. She's just, it's hard to see being bullied by a community that we've loved so much.
Yeah, it's a de facto denial of admission, and that's what it amounts to. Thank you, Katie. And if we have questions for you later, Maddie's tracking the questions. So
I do want to add that with Dignity, knowing my sister has taught at a Catholic high school for a long time, and at a different Catholic high school, one of her friends' partners was fired for same-sex marriage, and so my sister ended up leaving the Catholic high school, and my brother was a priest until 2 years ago, and this was just so much for him to comprehend, that he can't give communion to a group of people, and that the church is not going to accept our kids, and just the struggles as a priest he had trying to understand that. So not only has this affected us as a Catholic school family, my sister has left her 15-year job, and my brother has left the priesthood, because we have to expect more from our Catholic community.
Correct.
Thank you.
Thank you, Katie. Appreciate that. Okay. I want to move on to the Catholic healthcare subject. And Delphine, let me ask you, recognizing that the U.S. Conference on Catholic Bishops has prohibited transgender oh, uh, at Catholic owned institutions on the basis of its opposition to sterilization, which it views as immoral. What harm does this cause to both younger and older trans persons?
Thank you, Linda. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Again, thank you, Linda, for asking me to be a part of this. It's a great and challenging question. I think at the core, the risk is that we as trans people begin to internalize these messages, that we deserve to be mistreated, that we are worthless on some level. We know that the rates of suicide amongst trans youth are higher than with other communities. It sends a message not only to us as trans people, but to the wider world that we're second-class citizens. And as we've seen under the administration of President Trump, but even before that, the rise in discrimination and mistreatment of trans people of all ages. If we can deny healthcare, we can deny other basic human rights, which leads to trans people being murdered. Is that an extreme chain of events? Yes. However, is it also a reality? Yes. And lastly, just on a very personal, but on a spiritual level, do I deserve to be loved? If I don't have a place within the church, what is that? How does that impact my relationship with the divine? What is that, my relationship with God? Does God love me less? And so there are multiple different things that are at play with these policies.
Mm-hmm. Can you, Delphine, can you address the pending state legislative bills that attempt to restrict the provision of gender-affirming healthcare to transgender persons?
Will do my best. I posted in the chat for those who can see it, some organizations that are focusing on not only healthcare, but also education, sports, and other trans issues. The Movement Advancement Project, the National Center for Trans Equality, Center for American Progress, and the Transgender Law Center. We've seen, as Linda shared at the beginning, a rise in anti-trans legislation. In 2019, there were no bans in any state. In 2020, we saw 16 states introduce legislation. And then in 2021, there are 22 states considering bans. Of the 22, 11 of those states are considering it for the first time. And sadly, in Arkansas, in April of this year, a ban was put into place. And so we are starting to see a rise in anti-trans legislation. As Father Massengale said, a lot of that connected to issues of white nationalism and patriarchy and sexism and many other isms. Basically, what these laws are stating is that if a healthcare professional finds it against their religious and spiritual beliefs to provide care, that they can deny care to a trans person. I think at the core of this legislation is a lack of understanding of what it is that we as trans people go through, and that lack of understanding from those who are against us, but also those who are with us. A lot of folks don't realize that in order to change your driver's license, you need a doctor to sign off on it. In order to qualify for some of these services, if you can get them, there are financial resources that not everyone has access to, as well as having to go to a therapist and many other hoops and hurdles that trans people have to go through in order to be who they are. And specifically when it comes to trans youth, and I think Katie shared this very powerfully, kids know that they're different. They may not have the language, they may not have the terminology, but kids from a very young age know who they are, and we are banning them and preventing them to get health care that they need. I would argue that any person going to get plastic surgery should maybe see a therapist before they get said plastic surgery. And that's not me trying to shame or poo-poo folks who receive cosmetic surgery. Just because if I wanted to have surgery as a trans person, I have to go to a therapist, and the qualifications and requirements of all of these things are constantly changing. Lastly, I think it also impacts our access to resources. Folks very flippantly will say, well, if you can't go to a Catholic hospital, go to another hospital. What if the Catholic hospital is the only hospital in your area? Larger cities tend to have more resources, but those of us who live in more rural parts of the country don't have access to those resources. And so what if that is the only physician, healthcare provider that I can go to? And then lastly, I read an article about the bans, and one of the things that popped up that I hadn't thought of is that many Catholic hospitals are actually changing their names in order to be more inclusive. An example was given of a hospital in San Francisco who changed their name, interestingly enough, to Dignity Healthcare. However, because it is a Catholic hospital, it bans certain things, not just for trans folk, but when it comes to reproductive justice issues and other things. And so changing a name doesn't necessarily mean that there's a change in practice. And again, that goes back to what resources we have access to.
Right. Thank you. And lastly, Delphine, the American Academy of Pediatricians, which is obviously a very prestigious and medical organization in the United States, they support gender affirming practices, do they not?
Yes, they do. Along with the American Medical Association and several other entities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Delphine. Now I want to move on to Jason, and he's going to talk a bit about the Equality Act. In particular, Jason, can you also discuss the key elements of the U.S. Catholic Conference of Catholic Bishops' opposition to the passage of this important legislation, and how those arguments can be countered?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
Sound good.
Yes. Thank you for the invitation. And I'll go ahead and start with those questions by responding to the USCCB opposition. So what they claim is that this the Equality Act is exempt from the Bipartisan Religious Freedom Restoration Act, as well as to point to some of the things you'll be speaking about later, requires women to compete against men and boys in sports, forces religiously operated spaces and establishments like church halls, other host facilities.
Complicated.
Sorry.
It's complicated.
Let's see. I'm sorry. Got a little distracted there. Requires women to compete against men and boys. Forces faith-based charities to serve all people that violate, regardless of it violating their religious beliefs, according to the USCCB. Jeopardizes existing prohibitions on the use of taxpayer funds and hinders healthcare. To be perfectly honest, I think we all know that those claims are false. And so the truth about the Equality Act is that it prohibits discrimination against LGBTQI people in employment, housing, credit, jury service, public shared spaces, and services. But particularly around the claim that it is hurting religious liberty, as the USCCB claims. Many religious people would benefit from the act, and it would not undermine the current religious exemptions in the amended civil rights law, this would actually also then amend the civil rights law. And so, for example, people of faith would, in fact, receive new protections from discrimination. For example, protections from faith-based organizations and more public accommodations, such as prohibiting the use of "No Muslims Allowed" signs in retail stores. Meanwhile, other religious organizations would also retain all the same exemptions they currently have under civil rights laws such as Title VII. They would still be allowed to favor people of the same religion so long as they do not discriminate based on other protected characteristics. Importantly, the Equality Act clarifies the Religious Freedom Restoration Act cannot serve as defense against claims of discrimination. Therefore, it ensures religion cannot be weaponized as a license to discriminate, including against people for the religious beliefs in accordance with the RFRA intent. And so that's what. So I guess those are that's the opposition and what actually the equality actually does. And so I guess as I look this over, there are not many things that elements of these things that they oppose based on the Equality Act would prohibit discrimination in all the areas in which they specifically claim that it would hurt the community, it would hurt quote society. So yes, I guess an answer to your question: are there elements of opposition that the Equality Act couldn't overturn? Simple answer to that is no.
So
yes,
essentially, a lot of their opposition, their points of opposition, really have no substance, and you would think
they're all really couched in your usual homophobic, transphobic stereotypes and not grounded in actual reality.
Right, and really, the act, which I, when I first began to look into it myself, was that, I mean, why would the church, which has a fundamental, one of the fundamental principles of the Catholic Church is social justice and supporting, equality and anti-discrimination, why would they oppose it? But again, it relates back to its doctrine and teachings related to the LGBTQ population in particular. Can you, Jason, indicate this is an important thing because this legislation, as I mentioned, is sitting on the docket in the Senate. We're not sure when or if it will be brought up for discussion and vote, but hopefully it will this year. So it's important for us as supporters of this to play a role in the passage. So what can we do to help get this legislation over the goal line?
So to kind of give you some context and clarity around the timeline, so there was a plan to really, from the faith-based coalitions that I'm a part of, there was really a plan to, over the August recess, to move into a plan that, we're looking at something happening in September. And that was as of sort of July, mid-August of having those conversations. And we've seen that there was now that's really kind of been pushed to either October, November, given various other things that have been happening between, Afghanistan and the infrastructure bill and some other federal activities have really pushed that. So there's a possibility we could be looking at October. Others are saying that there's also a camp that's saying, it could look like November. So in the meantime, I've been keeping track of what my organization's been doing, and some of the organizations have been pushing out messaging that is encouraging people to reach out to their senators. So I think that when we talk about actions like emails, tweets, I think tweets are the most one of the most effective and a very quick response. So I think I would say emails, tweets, phone calls, because one of the things that we've really been hearing is that based on research and then the claims of the right wing has been how they've been 30 times the calls that people that support it. So it's really helpful to, even if your senator is gonna vote for it. So I'm from Illinois. Durbin and Duckworth are both going to support it. I mean, I'm from Illinois, but as a DC citizen, so obviously I've lost my senators. But in any case, if I were still in Illinois, I wouldn't necessarily need to be like, please support this. But I think it's as vital for senators who are supporting your legislation, if you happen to be in a very blue state, that they get that affirmation that, yes, thank you for supporting this. That's as important as trying to encourage people who are on the fence about supporting it. So I would encourage reaching out to both. So thank you.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Okay, and the last issue I wanted to touch on before we go to the Q&A is participation in sports. Now, in addition to, as I mentioned, the Catholic schools, all of the policies and procedures that have come out from the various dioceses that I mentioned, all in unison opposed any trans girls from participating in women's sports. But in addition to that, according to the Human Rights Campaign, there are 24 legislative bills submitted this year related to the subject of not allowing transgender females from competing on girls' women's sports teams in high school or college. It actually passed in Mississippi and Florida and active in the other 22 states. Interesting to note, the only known instance of unfairness, if you will, involves a couple of successful trans track members in Connecticut. So there really hasn't been any groundswell of this being, creating an unfair playing field, if you will. And I think it's also important to reference the policy of the NCAA, the National Conference on Athletics, National Conference Athletic Administration. The NCAA, which governs the majority of the college sports, actually, believe it or not, adopted a policy over 10 years ago, in 2010. Basically, what the policy says is that if you are suffer from gender dysphoria and you are, for example, a biological male that is transitioning to female, in order to participate on women's teams in college, you have to be undergoing testosterone suppression treatment. So that's to reduce your testosterone levels in your body, which reduces, largely reduces the biological advantages of being a male. So you have to be undergoing that treatment for 1 year, for a 1 year period. And it's monitored and has to be submitted and has to be tracked, and you have to have the documentation. But if you've done that, then you are permitted then as a transgender woman to participate on the women's teams in college. So it would seem to make sense that that policy, which it took a long time to develop that, because they had a team of science people, medical people, and others that debated this and went through it and came up with a very educated policy, which is, as I say, has been in effect for more than 10 years. So the question is, why can't the high schools adopt a similar policy so that you have this 1 year waiting period where you have to be going through the testosterone suppression treatment before you're allowed to compete? So it makes a lot of sense. But anyway, all those legislative bills are out there right now, and with potentially adverse consequences, and obviously how they would interact with the NCAA policy is uncertain. So, okay, we had a lot to cover, so I wanted to get all of these issues up on the table. I'll have a chance to let you know what they are, some of the background on them. And I think now, Maddie, we could turn it over for Q&A. You're tracking the questions.
Yes, no one has posted questions in the Q&A section of the chat, but definitely post any questions you want in the Q&A chat, but also feel free to unmute yourself or open up your video and ask your questions in person.
Okay. We'll wait a second here.
I have a question for Delphine. When do you think that, I'm obviously nervous about, sorry, it got a little loud. I'm obviously nervous about our hospital, Cincinnati Children's, being forced to stop provide what we need, and we're on blockers and we have hormones, and at the same time I'll drop her off somewhere and think, if she had to call an ambulance, her gender marker is male and her name is female, are they going to put her in the ambulance? Are we going to get the care that she needs? And so that's just probably my biggest fear at this point. What do you think about the progression of more and more states shutting down the care that our trans kids need?
That is a great question and hard to answer. It's with sort of mixed hope. What we've seen is in 2016, the Affordable Care Act was expanded to include trans health care services. And President Trump revoked some of those expansions, and then President Biden reaffirmed that trans people are covered under the Affordable Care Act. And in states that have tried, we've actually seen both the president and other politicians and leaders appeal and fight back. And so right now, what it looks like, there was a bill there's the Arkansas law, there's the North Dakota law, and then in Texas are the three areas where we've seen movement against trans healthcare. President Biden is actually appealing the North Dakota law. And what I've been able to gather from all of the reading I did in preparation for today is that HHS, Health and Human Services, is actually waiting to see what President Biden is going to do. And if his actions thus far serve as any indication, it's one of hope, but we don't know. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, and this isn't to intensify your fear, there have been incidents where emergency medical personnel have denied healthcare to a trans person. And so it's a real fear that unfortunately we don't talk about within the LGBT equality movement. Again, I think there's a lot of unintentional, unmalicious ignorance when it comes to the realities that we as trans people have to consider and the questions that we have considered. As Madeline shared in the chat, where are we going to find a job? How can we access healthcare? Where can we use the bathroom safely? It's a lot of questions that we wrestle with. And again, legislatively, politically, it's a little hopeful, but also nerve-wracking at the same time because we don't know. Again, we have hope. Similar to reproductive justice and issues around abortion, you have clergy and politicians making decisions about things that they are not experts in that ultimately do impact us. But I do know that several of the bans have been challenged either within the state or again on a federal level. And so hope, got to hold on to hope.
It's frustrating before my 16-year-old goes to, I mean, almost even our dentist. She has a scoliosis. She has, she's in the pediatrician. She has a stomach, just, 16-year-olds have problems. And I have to call in advance every time and say, first of all, my insurance, because we haven't got that gender marker changed yet. You have to process it as a male. And does your provider going to give my daughter the care we need?
Right.
And I just look forward to a time to where I don't feel like I have to, because her name has changed, she's female, but to where at this point, as a mom, I'm terrified. And if I leave her at school and an ambulance could show up and I'm not there, I don't know the reactions, just as much as I don't know the reaction of, her being pulled over with her driver's license. But it's so much scarier with healthcare. When you're driving to an ER with a sick kid and you think, our insurance is covered at a Catholic hospital, St. Vincent, are they going to take her?
Right.
So, and it's a very real fear. It's a very real fear.
Linda?
Mary Burns looks like she has a question.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So glad I joined this session. I just wanted to tell people that if you're close to date, and maybe you know about this, there is a really good health service called Equitas Health, Equitas. And I've been kind of, helping a young trans woman who is going through things like speech therapy. She's reducing her testosterone and increasing her estrogen, and she's doing a really good job. She's got a job and everything. But one of the things that happens with her is she's 23. She got her state ID changed and everything. She's very proud of that. She does not have her Social Security card changed. And so our next step is to try to see if that has to happen. Does anybody know if that has to happen?
Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. Lindy.
I just was asking if she's very worried about that. Should that be something I can help her with? No.
Well, when I transitioned, the first place I went was Social Security.
Okay, she didn't.
And they said get it changed there, and then they would pass the information on to the Department of Motor Vehicles to change the driver's license. But they said the starting point would be Social Security.
Okay, well, she doesn't drive, so it's just a state ID. Right. But she didn't start at Social Security, so I think our next kind of support trip is going to be, let's go to Social Security.
Yeah, that's the place to start. Yeah.
Mary, Equitas does work with Equality Ohio, and they do have a legal clinic that is free and can answer those questions and provide guidance on how to change that.
She's got a great case manager and she's got a therapist there. She's really active there. So. Thank you. I've become her grandmother, actually. So, what kind of
Thank you for doing that. Thank you.
I am so grateful she has a grandma like you. Yeah, we're still struggling with that. 5 years ago, we have got our name changed, but our Hamilton County is yet to allow us a gender marker. And so, we started in the courts and then started changing things from there. But because of the way our county is working, we are on a 6-year struggle with that and a lot of lawyer fees.
Wow.
Yeah.
But as a grandmother, just like I know, they're worth it. They are worth it.
She'll be happier.
She's been great. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I didn't address this earlier, but there's also another aspect to this is actually I think it was his first day in office. Joe Biden had signed an executive order, which was on preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. And that particular executive order was to extend the protections of the Civil Rights Act of '64, the Education Amendments of 1972, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. To all persons regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. Oh, Katie, if you could mute yours when you're not speaking, because I think that's the background noise. It also granted full access to restrooms, locker rooms, school sports, to trans non-binary persons access to health care and housing without sexual discrimination. The problem is that, it conflicts with these pending bills and what's currently federal legislation. So its impact, I don't think, has been very significant. It sit there, it to some extent was a gesture of his to support anti-discrimination, but I don't think it has had any immediate impact at this point. Jason, is there anything else you'd like to add to the discussion? Any of the topics, education, healthcare, Equality Act, sports, that you'd like to also add?
Well, I think for the also the Equality Act in relation to health care, for example, there's also a legislation, Do No Harm Act, that is making its way through the legislature. I'm uncertain. I think it was introduced in the House, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, it clarifies the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that essentially helps with more using religious exemptions to keep from treating people. So this obviously is an important legislation to really speak to what Delphine was raising.
Right.
And then the John Lewis Every Child Deserves a Family Act, which is something that I think we're all passionate about, but I just want to really lift up the opportunity to having worked with Marianne Duddy Burke, who's very passionate, obviously, about this legislation. It prohibits discrimination in adoption and foster care, among other things. Obviously, there's room for discrimination based on sexual orientation, sexual identity, sexual expression, but then also in areas of race, of being a single woman, for example, are all ways. And so this legislation helps that, would confront that.
Great.
So those are some of the other things that
Additional
keep an eye on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Delphine, is there anything else you'd like to comment on in any of these areas, any of these issues?
I think one of the things that popped up in my mind is here in Ohio, one of the anti-sports and trans people bills is actually couched in wanting to protect women and girls in the locker room and bathroom. And like with the healthcare bans and other anti-trans policies, it's based a lot in misinformation, but sort of the assumption that trans people are going to assault people in the bathroom. Sadly, we know that the reverse is what's true. It's trans people who are being assaulted in the restroom. And sort of the snarky activist in me was like, okay, protection of women and girls, well, what about the protection of other people who go to the bathroom? Why are we, sort of privileging and lifting up this one group? But again, it's couched in a lot of misinformation and misunderstandings of who we are as trans people and the spectrum of trans identities that exist.
Yeah, thank you. I have just a short, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but just a short conversation about my own situation. So I belong to a Catholic church here in Florida, Central Florida, which is predominantly, well, it's a retirement community. So it's very white, very advanced in age, very conservative, but it's the church in my area. So, but interestingly enough, I was attracted to the church because of its mission, which said it was welcoming of all people, regardless of their marital situation, their gender, et cetera, et cetera. and became good friends with the pastor who invited me to dinner. And there's about 4,500 families in the parish, so it's very large. And he invited me to dinner to get to know me better. We had a nice dinner, and I told him I wanted to volunteer. I applied later to be an extraordinary minister and an altar server. And he said, "Oh, great, let me know how it goes." And I went through the training, and I did one mass that I served, and then he called me and he said, "Oh, Linda, I'm going to have to take you off the schedule for both." And he said, "There have been complaints about you being part of the ministry." And he did not, he was very apologetic. And he said, "I'm sorry." And I told him, I said, "Father, I'll tell you my reaction." I said, "Number one, I am very hurt. I'm very disillusioned. I'm very angry. And I'm also very embarrassed because I went through the training. People say, 'What happened to Linda?' I thought she was going to be altar server." And after my allies, this is the importance of allies. So several allies of mine approached him and said, "Father, you're in charge here. You can make the decision. You can put her back on. You don't have to listen to a few people who want to complain and think that, that they follow the hierarchical church's teaching that I'm living an immoral life." So he, in fact, did. He put me back on, and I thanked him. And about a week or two later, he sent me a message and said, "Linda, I have received complaints and notification from the Diocese of Orlando, from the bishop's office, that you will not be allowed to serve in the ministry of either extraordinary minister or altar server." And so whoever complained in my parish, obviously, when that was unsuccessful, took their complaints to the bishop. I wrote back to the pastor, and I thanked him for supporting me, and I knew he did not agree with the decision. And I wrote a letter to the bishop, for which I've not received any response. But I wasn't sure. I was expecting a response, but I wanted to write anyway because I had to stand up for myself. Those are the kind of things that happen. Those are the kind of things that happen. Trying to be part of the ministry and trying to be part of the church. And all it takes maybe is a few people who, don't agree with who you are and how you identify and want to stop that. And, the allies help. I mean, as many allies as we can assemble in any context is helpful. It's very important that we do that. But that's a little story that happened to me recently. So it's still out there, this discrimination. And I'll go on. I'll recover from it. I haven't left the church, although I threatened to leave. I threatened the father. I told him, "You may have lost a sheep," and he was very upset to hear that. But I'm going to stick it out, and still, because I got to push from I believe that we have to push for change internally. If we walk away, the church will have no motivation to change. So. Anyway, any questions, Maddie?
Yes, we have a question from Anne Marie. I think it's kind of a vocabulary question. So it's we often hear a lot about trans women, but they're asking, what do we define as the trans spectrum? So can we talk a little bit about the spectrum of trans people that encompasses much more than trans women?
Yeah, I think, all of the things we've talked about today affect both trans women, trans men. like on the sports issue, as I mentioned, it doesn't seem to be an issue of trans men participating in male sports because they figure, well, they already have a disadvantage because they're biologically women, so they don't care about that. So that's not an issue they try to stand their ground on. But it does occur mainly to transgender women. But all of these issues, the Catholic schools, the healthcare, the Quality Act, all of the issues we've talked about apply equally to trans men, and not in all cases, but the majority also to the non-binary population.
I think I may have been the person who said trans spectrum, and just to echo Linda, yes, trans women, trans men, but looking at trans as a spectrum or umbrella that encompasses a variety of different identities. For a long time, we limited the conversation to men who transitioned to be women, women who transitioned to be men, and was very much on a binary. But more and more expanding that to include, as Linda shared, non-binary folk, genderqueer folk, so on and so forth. That it is a spectrum of identities, not just limited to folks who live and exist on a binary.
Yeah, exactly. Okay. Other questions? We have about 10 minutes. If there's anything else that anyone wishes to bring up or ask a question or make a statement.
I guess something I wanted to quickly point out, as I reflect on just the Equality Act, and particularly let's say the piece around women in athletics, be they cisgender, transgender, non-binary, choosing to, etc. I will say that I find it's just strange that I grew up in some of the very, very conservative contexts that spawn this kind of ridiculous legislation. And in growing up, it was all about perpetuating ideas around what cisgender women were supposed to behave like. And so it's ironic that because they were obsessed to the point of what is proper, and women participating in sports, cisgender women in their context, participating in sports was considered, well, on the worst case scenario, sinful, on the best case scenario, unladylike. So I'm struggling to process watching many of the same type of people that I was raised around, come from this theological concept that they thought that women participating in sports was sinful and or wrong and or unladylike, but now are championing the defeat of the Equality Act based on championing the rights of young women to participate in sports, which by their definition is unladylike and sinful.
Yeah. How the world has changed, Jason. Finn, are you still on, Finn? We have a few minutes. I don't know if Finn is still in the room. He wanted to talk a little bit about his transition. If you don't know Finn, Duddy Burke, he is Marianne and Becky's son, who is in the process of transitioning, just turned 18. I don't know if Finn's still here. Can I see who's in the room? Let's see, right there. He said if we had a few moments, he just wanted to talk about his particular journey. And I don't know if he's still here.
I believe he's still in the chat. Ben, if you are here, if you request to share your screen, I can make sure you get added.
Yeah. No. Still here? Still here. People. Oh, here we go. Finn. Finn. I don't see Finn now on the list. Oh. I don't see him. Let's see. Nope. Okay.
Did anyone else have any other questions they would want the panelists to touch on?
Okay, well, if not, I hope this has been informative. Again, there's a lot of issues affecting the trans, non-binary population, and a lot of it is centered around the Catholic Church, which it's either an issue of the doctrine of the Church, or it's intervening in secular decisions and legislation. USCCB, is the biggest opposition force, and I know the board of directors of DignityUSA has identified that the USCCB continues to be our principal opposition, and trying to find ways that we can further educate or convince or change the perspective of that body, because it's really key to changing the mindset and the treatment of trans non-binary people. So with that, I guess we just leave. And Maddie, we just leave here and then go to the stage, I guess?
Yep.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. And thank to my panelists for participating. Appreciate it.
Blessings all.
Thank you, everyone. Much appreciated.
You're welcome. Thank you.